Republican frontrunner Donald Trump skipped out on the GOP's first official primary debate to instead have a chat with Tucker Carlson, which I imagine was probably even more excruciating. During the course of that conversation, the subject of Donald Trump's many, many indictments came up, and then Donald Trump indulged in a tactic that I complain about all the time on this channel called a false equivalence, featuring Stacey Abrams and Hillary Clinton. But before we unpack all that, if you haven't yet, please hit that like, subscribe, and the alert bell. Maybe check out my Patreon. I'd appreciate the support. All right, so yeah, false equivalence. It's a thing I complain about quite a bit on this channel, and in many of the debates you've probably seen me in with centrists and with conservatives, and perhaps even with fellow progressives. I complain about it when Luke Beasley and I collaborate. I complain about it when my buddy Stacey and I collaborate. It is a very irrational, very common, very dangerous tool employed by, I would say, cynics very often. Like, people cynically employ it deliberately to try to obfuscate things, but also those who are blindly, uncritically partisan, okay? And Donald Trump is no exception. So, as you all know, Donald Trump is he's being buried in an avalanche of indictments coming from the federal government and coming from state and local governments as well. And as far as I can tell, he's earned every single one. I have zero sympathy for him. But obviously the highest profile ones pertain to his attempt to steal the 2020 election from now President Biden. And the subject comes up of indictments in this conversation between Tucker Carlson and Donald Trump. And I want to play some clips, and then we are going to debunk this false equivalence in real time. Take it away, Donnie.
The people see it, like this horrible district attorney from just a little while ago, from essentially Atlanta, that's Fulton County. She said, basically, I don't have any right to challenge an election. Well, what about Stacey Abrams? What about Hillary Clinton? What about all of these Democrats that are still challenging my election? The same people that are saying he's challenging an election challenged my election. And they did it with slates. They did it with all sorts of things. They were very bad about it. But basically, they're suing me, and they're saying, you don't have any right to challenge it. If you challenge an election, we're going to indict you and put you in jail. So what they're doing is they've weaponized, and don't kid yourself, the DOJ and Biden and the whole group, they're watching all of this.
So there's a lot to unpack there, and I probably should have interrupted in real time, although I get complaints in the comments section, like, why don't you let the full clip play? And it's like, because there's so many falsehoods and things to address that you can lose track of it. So number one, it's very important. Donald Trump is not being indicted by anybody, anywhere, for challenging the results of the election, denying the results of the election, or even lying about the results of the election. Jack Smith, in particular, flatly, preemptively debunked that claim. He's like, listen, people have a right to lie, right? That's it. So Donald Trump has a right to lie about the election. What he doesn't have a right to do under state or federal law is to try to steal illegally the results of that election. He can challenge the results of an election in court. He can demand recounts. He can demand audits. He has a variety of legal tools available to him. He doesn't have a right to scheme or engage in conspiracy with others to illegally or corruptly change electors or send fraudulent electors, or to try to get the vice president to single-handedly, unilaterally overturn the results of the election. He doesn't have a right to scheme to seize voting machines or anything like that. He does not have a right to deny or lie about the election to the extent that he tries to commit a fraud on the American people. That's the distinction. So when Donald Trump says, they're basically suing me for challenging or denying the results of the election, he is flatly, unambiguously lying. And we're going to address the Stacey Abrams and Hillary Clinton comments here in a minute, but I also want to point this out as well.
Stacey Abrams in Georgia should be indicted because she still thinks she won the election for governor. She still thinks that. She's never recanted. And
Do you think Stacey Abrams will be indicted for that?
No, of course not. She won't be. The Democrats don't get indicted for things like that. They don't get impeached.
Well, I would argue, sir, that the reason that they don't get indicted or impeached is because they don't actually engage in the behavior that you did, right? So this is why I'm talking about false equivalence. I mean, and this is just so complicated. There's so many facets to it, I guess I would say. So number one, I think some people labor under the impression that if a Republican or person A is indicted for something, then you have to indict person B. Well, only if person B does effectively the same thing, right? Otherwise, you're just asking for some sort of weird law, some sort of cosmic rule which dictates that, if you indict or impeach a Republican, then you have to indict and impeach a Democrat. It doesn't matter what the facts are. It doesn't matter whether or not they've committed effectively the same crime or something similar. You just got to have some sort of arbitrary balance. That's not how the justice system works. It's not how it should work. It's not how it should have ever worked, okay? If Democrats did what Donald Trump did, then yes, there should be indictments and impeachments. But the thing is, that's not what happened. So let's first deal with Hillary Clinton, because that's the one I think that's most, it's not the freshest. I guess it is. I guess no, it wasn't, because Hillary Clinton actually predates the first Stacey Abrams thing, because that was 2018. But Hillary Clinton's she's more well known. So Hillary Clinton conceded the day of and the next day, publicly, unambiguously. I concede the race. She called Donald Trump. She gave a press conference. She did all the things. She showed up at Donald Trump's inauguration. She was part of the peaceful transfer of power. Hillary Clinton never schemed with then President Obama, an ally of hers, or then Vice President Joe Biden, who was certifying Donald Trump's win. She never said, "Hey, Joe, you're the vice president, overturn the results of the election," right? Like Trump tried to do in 2020 with his own vice president. She never did that. She never schemed to send false electors or anything like that, even though some celebrities did a PSA saying, hey, states could send alternative electors, which was inappropriate, but it wasn't done at the behest of Hillary Clinton. Hillary Clinton never considered it. Hillary Clinton never schemed to do it. Hillary Clinton never tried to sue her way into the White House. Donald Trump did, filed over 60 court cases in various districts to try to sue his way into a second term. Hillary Clinton never did that. Hillary Clinton never directed a riotous mob to attack the Capitol to prevent the peaceful transfer of power. There are many fundamental distinctions which separate Donald Trump from Hillary Clinton, which factually prove Hillary Clinton's moral, ethical, and intellectual superiority, as well as the fact that she is a vastly superior statesperson. Right? She cares about this country infinitely more than Donald Trump ever did and ever will. So now let's turn to Stacey Abrams. So this one is, relatively speaking, a bit more obscure because it wasn't a presidential race. So in 2018, Stacey Abrams ran as a Democrat for governor of Georgia, okay? And she was running up against a man who was at the time the Secretary of State of Georgia. He was the current Secretary of State at the time, which means he was overseeing, in effect, the operations of his own election. So kind of like how Republicans complained in 2022 that Katie Hobbs, who's now the governor of Arizona, she was the state Secretary of State, and a lot of Republicans complained, this is a conflict of interest. She shouldn't be able to technically be in charge of the office which oversees elections while running against somebody else. Well, Republicans didn't care about that in Georgia in 2018. It was perfectly okay for a Republican Secretary of State to oversee his own election for governor up against a rival, whatever. But his name was Brian Kemp, and he was the state Secretary of State at the time. Here's where it gets fishy, okay? So Brian Kemp announces his candidacy for the governorship in mid-July mid-2017, right? Maybe about July. And then in that time, months later, before the election, but after he announced his candidacy, Brian Kemp oversaw the purge of, I think it was more than 700,000 registered voters. They were deleted from the voter rolls. There was a purge of the voter rolls, okay? So before we dive into that, though, just at the time in 2018, after the election, after she lost, Stacey Abrams on Friday acknowledged that Republican Brian Kemp will become the next governor of Georgia, ending her bid to become the first African-American woman to lead a state. The announcement followed more than a week of post-election legal maneuvering from her campaign and allies as they sought to find enough votes to reduce Kemp's lead and force a December 4th runoff. She was considering further legal challenges as recently as Friday morning, but ultimately made the decision to end her campaign in a fiery speech to supporters at her headquarters in Atlanta. She did, however, announce plans for a major federal lawsuit against the state of Georgia for the gross mismanagement of this election and to protect future elections from constitutional actions. Okay? So even this, in 2018, is substantively different than what Donald Trump did, because she formally ended her race 1 week later. Not 1 month later, not 2 months later, not 3 months later, not 4 months later, nor did she direct a mob to attack the Georgia state capitol. Major fundamental distinction. She says, listen, I don't think this was fair. I don't think this was right. I've considered legal options, but ultimately I'm deciding to end my campaign, and I'm going to sue the state of Georgia to protect future elections just to make sure this never happens again. Even that would have been fundamentally different. It had Donald Trump done the same thing, but he didn't. He didn't do that. So that's one major difference. But again, as I was talking about, voting right, this is an article from 2018 in the Associated Press, and it talks about people who were purged from the voters list. And again, let's see. But through a process that Kemp calls voter roll maintenance and his opponents call voter roll purges, Kemp's office has canceled over 1.4 million voter registrations since 2012. Nearly 670,000 registrations were canceled in 2017 alone. And by the way, the margin by which Stacey Abrams lost that election to Brian Kemp in 2018 was about 50,000 votes. Relatively slim margin when you consider the amount of the amount of eligible voters who were purged before the election. Okay, so there was actually a factual predicate here. Kemp may not have been sinister in his approach. That's, I suppose, subjective and a matter for investigation. And there were investigations which say that 340,000 votes were improperly purged, according to an election. Georgia's Secretary of State and gubernatorial candidate Brian Kemp improperly purged more than 340,000 voters from the state's registration rolls and investigation charges. Greg Palast, a journalist and the director of the Palast Investigative Fund, said an analysis he commissioned found 340,130 voters were removed from the rolls on the grounds that they'd moved, but they actually still live at the address to which they're registered. Now, again, that's an investigation, and this was 5 years ago. It's entirely possible that it's been debunked since then. I don't know. As far as I know, the conclusions of this investigation were not debunked in any way. But the bottom line is Stacey Abrams has much more of a factual predicate to complain about the adjudication of the 2018 Georgia gubernatorial race than Donald Trump does about the 2020 presidential race, when his own Department of Justice, his own Department of Homeland Security, and Republican allies in every state came back and they were like, Mr. President, believe me, we wanted you to win. We looked into this. We did audits. We did recounts. We looked under mattresses. And at the end of the day, there's nothing here. As a matter of fact, in many of these election or recounts and audits, it actually increased President Biden's victory. Okay, so you see what I'm saying? Instantly, all sorts of fundamental, meaningful differences between them. And then I'll also say simply this in summation too. Having said all of that, was it inappropriate for Stacey Abrams to give the rhetoric that she did? Arguably. I think you can easily make that case. But she was infinitely more just in challenging and denying and questioning the results of the 2018 gubernatorial race than Donald Trump. And that, to me, is the important part. She ended her campaign. She forewent and chose not to pursue certain legal challenges. She didn't drag this out over the span of months. She did not stage an attempted coup or thwarting the Governor Kemp's or then Secretary of State Kemp's election. She didn't do anything like that. And there seems to at least be some basis for her to seriously question the election. Again, given the fact that proper or not, legally justified or legally permitted or not, State Secretary of State Brian Kemp purged hundreds of thousands of registered voters from the rolls, which means it was going to be more difficult for those potential eligible voters to vote, because then they would have to re-register. They would, number one, have to be informed and be aware of the fact that they're no longer registered. They would have to have the means, the opportunity to register again. And by definition, you are going to suppress voter turnout, just by definition, by doing that, because you are increasing the number of hurdles between a potential eligible voter and casting their ballot. Whether or not it was all illegally done or inappropriate, there's room for debate about that. And to be clear, there were court cases which found that Brian Kemp did not violate Georgia's Constitution. Okay, I want to make that very clear. So he did win very crucial legal challenges. He himself is not without protection in this respect. But before I wrap it up in terms of Stacey Abrams in 2022, because she ran for governor again, I'll simply say this. There is an election expert. Oh, what is his name? I'm blanking on his name. He's Richard Hassan, okay, and he works, I think he still works at Yale. He actually condemned or pushed back on Stacey Abrams' election denial claims. So she said, Second, the charge of a second stolen election is unproven. Although Hillary Clinton declared in November 2018 that if Abrams had had a fair election, she already would have won. In California, Senator Kamala Harris tweeted in May 19, let's say this loud and clear without voter suppression at Stacey Abrams, it's on Twitter, is Governor Stacey Abrams. We do not know that Kemp's suppression efforts cost Abrams the seat. As Ari Berman puts it, we don't know yet, and may never know, how many people were disenfranchised or dissuaded from voting in the state. But it's clear that Kemp did everything in his power to put in place restrictive voting policies that would help his candidacy and hurt his opponent, all whilst overseeing his own election. Okay, so again, it doesn't completely justify where Stacey Abrams was coming from, but at least lends more credibility to her position by far than anything to come from Donald Trump. And the very last thing I'll say is that unlike Donald Trump in 2022, when she ran against Brian Kemp again in a rematch, and she lost again, this time she did concede. She called him that night and said the race was over, and then gave a public speech as well. So I know that was very long and probably throwing a risk here by making that video this long, but I think it's important because people will try to confuse you. Republican apologists and conservative apologists will attempt to confuse you by saying, listen, what Donald Trump did, they're trying to criminalize free speech. They're trying to criminalize denying an election, and Democrats do the same thing. A, Donald Trump is not being indicted for free speech. B, Donald Trump is not being indicted for denying or lying about the results of an election. And C, Democrats and Donald Trump, and when I say Democrats, I include Stacey Abrams and Hillary Clinton, the examples he cited, they did not do the same thing. There are vast, meaningful, fundamental distinctions between, first Abrams and Hillary even, but Hillary and Abrams, and then Trump as well. That's what you call a false equivalence. What Donald Trump did, learn to spot it, learn to reject it outright, don't indulge it. Don't play the game, don't be super charitable. Be like, no, I'm not obligated to pretend that these three things are remotely comparable. They're not. And what Donald Trump did was verifiably, objectively, in many ways, much worse. Period.